So what do we watch for? Obviously, we should look for the areas that are more likely to indicate serious problems. These key areas that could very much be a symptom of something, wait a second, we'd better look into that. We look for unusual types of activity, something which is abnormal or different from the normal type of activity on the system. We look for patterns and we look for trends, where something maybe has changed in some way, or where there's some type of defined pattern that could indicate some type of known attack signature. We also look for repeated violations. These quite often can be related to someone doing some type of network scanning or someone trying to probe our system for weaknesses. We look for people that have entered passwords incorrectly. Could this be someone attempting some type of brute force attack against our user IDs? We also look at where people are logging in at strange times. The average user should not be logging in at 3 o'clock in the morning. And so we'll pick up when all of a sudden, wait a second, why is this user ID in use at a time which is not normal? And again, this can then indicate a need to do a little bit more in-depth review or investigation. To identify violations is to identify something that may be serious or in some cases may turn out to be a false positive. It is important that we're able to do the analysis to be able to determine what is really significant and what really isn't. The first step in this, of course, is to notify the appropriate staff and escalate if it looks like it's a serious problem. The notification to maybe senior management, and so the various response mechanisms can then, of course, be initiated. If we have a serious violation, it's always good to immediately contain the situation, stop it from spreading or getting worse. But at the same time, protect then the evidence. Protect it and preserve it so that we can do a thorough, accurate investigation and that we're able then to truly determine what happened, who did it, and certainly what the extent of the damage then is. A part of this is determining the severity, the scope of the problem, the potential impact of the problem. Does it impact just internal or possibly even external parties? When we've done an investigation, it could be that we're going to lead to some type of disciplinary action. And disciplinary action is going to be based on the enforcement of our policies and procedures. And disciplinary action, of course, could even lead up to termination of employment. The idea, of course, is that disciplinary action, it's important to have that ability to then enact that when necessary. If there's an employee that has done something wrong, so certainly they can be removed from then the work site. The idea of disciplinary action is as a deterrent, that people know that if they do something wrong, then action will be taken. After every violation, we should review our procedures. Why did this violation happen? Was it because maybe my controls weren't good enough? Maybe was it because we weren't monitoring the employees correctly? Maybe it was because we had a weakness or flaw in our system. When we review our procedures, and of course part of review will be looking at the feedback and lessons learned to say, can we improve our prevention, detection, and response then to this type of an incident should it happen in the future. Quite often we're going to also need then to communicate or report on this actual violation or incident as well. This could be to internal or even external bodies depending on the type of incident it is. We should make sure we communicate in an honest but also a careful way that does not then disclose information that should not have been disclosed to unauthorized parties. In managing access, we looked earlier at using things like access control lists. But in the case of a database, we'll often use what we call a database view. A database view is then a logical subset of the data within the database. The database might have a lot of information on a customer, But for myself, maybe I don't need to see all of that information. I only need to see or be able to view that information which is impertinent to my job. So the front-end application will then call which view I should be allowed to see of that database. It's important that we log all access, both successful and unsuccessful. If something was done, so we know who did it, and if somebody's trying to do something, we can ask them why if they're unauthorized on that system. We talked then about protecting the logs so we can do the investigations thoroughly. And it's also good to make our logs into a standard format, a standard naming convention, a standard date format, so that the data is easily comparable and can prevent some type of confusion. The idea of data protection and, of course, data retention is to make sure that I don't lose critical data. This is something we look at when we talk about business continuity planning and what we call the recovery point objective. How much data are you willing to lose? Well, obviously, this is indicated by the frequency of our backups. If we back up once a week, we've really said that we'd accept the loss of a week's worth of data. Well, if that's not acceptable, we need to back up much more frequently. Quite often with databases, since they are critical to business operations, we actually might back them up using mirroring, for example. There's a number of different types of backups we can do: on-site, near-site, and off-site. When I'm going to send my data off-site, I want to make sure that data is protected. So even at that off-site location, if someone was able to grab that data, it still then would not be then meaningful to them. It has been encrypted. The other thing is, if I'm going to use something like a tape backup, which we use when we have a lot of data that needs to be stored, for example, off-site, has the risk that a tape can only be used a certain number of times and for a certain length of time. Tapes have a certain age, they have a certain number of uses, same as solid-state drives. A solid-state drive really only has a limited number of uses before it's no longer going to be reliable. In protecting our backups, we do need to check on those two things: the age and, of course, number of uses of our storage media. We should back up our data using then consistent formats and structure, and of course our data dictionaries that indicate where our information is actually being stored and used. We should have a retention policy. We need to keep our data as long as the business would need it, or as long as we're required to keep it by law. But you don't want to have a situation where we're keeping data long after it is no longer then required. A situation like that can then, of course, lead to a greater liability as well for the organization. So we should be familiar with what is required according to regulatory requirements that say you must keep this data for 7 to 10 years, as well as, of course, how long is it going to be that the business needs that data. Now, one of the things we will do is quite often archive data as well. That means it'll still be retrievable, but it could be, of course, much slower retrieval process. At the end of life, data should be deleted in a secure manner. Now, obviously, when do we delete it is dependent on our data retention policy. The policy says that you must keep it for this length of time, but should also then be backed up by procedures that say how will that data be securely deleted when it's no longer needed. We have then that retention policy that might include everything from emails to old customer records and so on, based, as we said before, on business and regulatory requirements. But in the end, resulting in a secure disposal of then that data. Now this means two things. Number one, if I'm going to dispose of my data, then I have to make sure it's properly and deleted off of any storage media that we have it on. This could mean overwriting it many times, or if it's very sensitive data, could actually require the physical destruction of that storage media. This, of course, is complicated with the cloud, where my data is stored on another system at another data center that I don't control. How do I make sure that that cloud provider properly disposes of old equipment? Or if I move from one cloud provider to another, how can I be sure that the first cloud provider then did securely dispose of all of my data that was on their systems? These are things that need to be addressed, of course, through the policies and procedures we put in place when we enter into a cloud provider, service provider contract. The risk always is that old equipment is replaced and discarded without properly having been then degaussed, or to make sure that the data that on it has been then thoroughly and completely disposed of.